Not everybody knows that every time the National Council on Disability celebrates the anniversary of Americans with Disabilities Act, we're really celebrating our own agency's history as well. And as the two are inextricably and proudly linked, in large part thanks to the efforts of Bob Burgdorf Jr., who I'm thrilled to introduce you to now. Mr. Burgdorf can be best characterized as a visionary architect of civil rights for people with disabilities. He is a leading disability rights writer, scholar, litigator, and legislative draftsperson. With a legal mind that's both empathetic and strategic, Bob has spent his career tirelessly advancing the causes of equality and inclusivity. His dedication to the disability rights movement was not merely professional, it was a personal crusade, deeply woven into the fabric of his life and work. He is a person with a disability, living with the effects of polio since the age of 1. He has advocated for, written about equal rights for people with disabilities for over 50 years, was involved in many of the formative court decisions establishing legal rights of individuals with disabilities. Even in the early stages of his career, while still in law school, Bob was already envisioning a national framework that could guarantee civil rights for people with disabilities. He helped establish, while in law school, the National Center for Law and the Handicapped, the first national legal advocacy center for people with disabilities. He was a key figure in drafting the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act as a staff member of the National Council on Disability. He was a professor at David A. Clark School of Law since 1989, emeritus from 2014. He taught courses on disability rights law, constitutional law, and co-founded and directed the Legislation Clinic. He was the principal author and general editor of the first law school casebook on the subject of disability rights, the legal rights of handicapped persons. Bob retired from teaching in 2014, but he took on a stint as a federal court special master in 2016, and since 2017, he continues to be a prolific writer on disability rights. Bob has been married to Dr. Andy Farbman for 34 years. They have 4 adult daughters, each highly accomplished. And his work continues through one of his daughters, Molly, who focuses on disability issues as the section chief in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. Molly is well known and highly regarded and highly respected by the National Council on Disability. Everybody, please help me in welcoming Bob Burgdorf. So Bob, I want to start at the beginning. In my mind, there's the Magna Carta, Declaration of Independence, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, I think you know, having been on the National Council of Disability, that the chair is presidentially appointed. The president who appointed me is Mr. Joe Biden. And so he trained me in this. Sir, you wrote the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a big friggin' deal. That is a big friggin' deal. Take us back. Does it sink in with you that you wrote the first and second and perhaps third iteration of the Americans with Disabilities Act? This is not only landmark civil rights legislation for the millions of people in the United States, but it served as model legislation for numerous countries throughout the world. What say you?
Well, first I say thank you, Andres. I'm really honored to share the stage with you. You mentioned my 50-year career. Many of my significant accomplishments in my career were done with or for the National Council on Disability. So I owe a lot to this entity. I was sort of there at the beginning. I was working at the General Counsel's Office of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which was, I was working with another lawyer, Chris Bell, a blind lawyer, and we wrote the Commission's first report on rights of people with disabilities. And I was in my office, and we were kind of looking, most of the people there at that time it was kind of a downtime for the commission. We were looking for other jobs. And a piece of paper came across my desk, and I don't know who on the commission staff put it there, but it was a new law. And it said, Congress is creating an independent federal agency. There had been a National Council on Disability, as Mr. Coelho mentioned earlier, but it was kind of floundering. And this piece of legislation said there will be a National Council on Disability. The name changed slightly, but it was charged with reviewing all federal laws and programs affecting people with disabilities and recommending how to improve those laws and programs. And it was to issue a report to the President and Congress giving advice and recommendations on what should be done. I looked at this and I thought about the experiences I had had doing disability rights law, writing about it, representing clients with disabilities, and I said, maybe somewhat presumptuously, I should work there. And so I set about to apply. It turned out there was an obstacle that I thought was going to be insurmountable, which was that the council had already hired an executive director and had given him 4 professional slots to hire staff for.
And that was Lex Frieden.
That was Lex Frieden. He was the first executive director of the council. And the 4 positions were for a children's services specialist, a rehabilitation specialist, the position that, well, I'll hold that story. But there was the position that, anyway, there were 4 positions. There was none for a lawyer. And I'm thinking, how are you going to review all federal laws and programs and make legislative recommendations without a lawyer? It happened around this time that a bunch of lawyers in Washington decided to get together with Lex and kind of tell him what their hopes were for the National Council on Disability. And I was one of the lawyers who was sitting there, and Lex introduced himself and just described his background. And then he was queried by one of the people at the meeting of, how many lawyers do you have? And he said, none. And they said, well, you got to have some lawyers. You're going to do this legal stuff. You're going to make legal analysis. You're going to make legislative recommendation. And Lex said, well, I understand that, but I didn't decide this. This was a decision of the council members. And then he added, as a little afterthought, I guess if some lawyer applied for one of those 4 positions, I'd have to consider them. Well, by that time, I had already submitted my application, and the application period had closed. So I'm sitting there like the cat that ate the canary thinking, I got a shot here. And Lex was true to his word. He interviewed me, and I had to say that I was hired as the research specialist. And what they really had in mind was somebody who did rehabilitation research and that kind of technical, whatever. It certainly wasn't law. And so I started saying, well, I've written this law school casebook. I had to do a lot of research for that. And I've worked for the Civil Rights Commission and put together this report. I had to do a lot of research for that. Well, I don't think I fooled him, but my ploy worked, and they hired me as the research specialist. And that was what gave me the chance to work on the several reports that I worked on with the National Council. And Lex was a really good person to work for. I want to, in hitting the highlights, I want to just mention 4 dates, or 4 years. 1984, 1986, 1988, and 1990. These are ever 2-year increments. 1984 was when the National Council was authorized and came into being.
1984 is also when you co-wrote the statutory blueprint for eliminating disability discrimination.
While I was at the Civil Rights Commission, you're forcing me to go off on that story, but
you are,
which I like.
Because it's critically important, right? It's the predicate to everything you're going to do at the council.
Yeah, I mentioned Chris Bell and I co-wrote this report. The report was called Accommodating the Spectrum of Individual Abilities, and what really was the Civil Rights Commission's first dabbling in the whole issue of rights of people with disabilities. And most of the Commission's reports would include legislative recommendations. And the Commission was too new to this issue, and they decided they didn't want this report, much to Chris and my disappointment, to include legislative recommendations. So we were kind of peeved about that, and then we decided, well, maybe we should just go off on our own and write an article that says what we learned in all this research and what we think ought to happen. And the thing we discussed was that we needed a comprehensive law prohibiting discrimination based on disability. So we wrote this report that we called a statutory blueprint. And it was published in an American Bar Association journal, the Mental and Physical Disabilities Law Reporter. And in it, we said there should be such a thing. Congress ought to use the power that it has to establish such a thing. And it ought to include certain things, like a right to reasonable accommodation, which was not in any statutory law at that time. It was invented in some regulations put out under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. In any event, there were a bunch of other things. It ought to be comprehensive. It ought to provide proper remedies for findings of discrimination. And so we had this thing published, and Chris and I thought, oh, somebody in Capitol Hill is going to read this and say, great, let's go do it. Didn't hear a word. We might as well have dropped that article in the river. It didn't generate anything. But when I was hired by the National Council, I had that in my back pocket. I'd been thinking about it and writing about it and dreaming of it, I suppose. And here was a chance. I didn't know what was going to happen with the National Council. I hadn't met the council members except for a few, and I had no idea what its plans were, its politics. And I was kind of nervous about the whole thing. But I felt like I've got to try. And the next thing that Lex did, that 1984 law said the council should issue a report to the president and Congress by 1986, making recommendations. And so Lex quite rightly looked at that charge and said, we can't do all areas. So he came up with the idea of we'll just do certain. And so the council members decided and discussed and debated, and they came up with 10 topic areas. And under each of those topics, they either had staff or they hired outside consultants to write an analytical paper. And I was given the one that they were calling civil rights, which we kind of quickly changed to calling it equality rights.
And Bob, was this part of the Towards Independence?
Well, that's what it culminated in. The 10 topic areas produced 10 topic papers that are in a gigantic appendix that was produced with a report called...
There are two threshold seminal reports of the National Council on Disabilities. One is Towards Independence, and the other is On the Threshold of Independence, that Bob co-authored as well. And so that really is what led to the drafting of the legislation. So
for those of you who can't see, I'm holding up a little booklet. It's called Toward Independence. It's about 4 inches by 7 inches, something like that, maybe a ½ inch thick. It's a small report. And it's a royal blue color, and it has a flying eagle on the front. That was one of Lex's things. He really liked that flying eagle. In any event, After a while, I got to be the point person to pulling that report together, and I took those 10 topic papers and I boiled them down into recommendations, and we produced the appendix as a separate publication. But then this was the council's first claim to fame. It really put the council on the map. Mm-hmm. And the council members really debated about which topic goes first and what are we going to recommend under that. I was steering the equal opportunity laws paper, and they sort of seemed to love it. The council members took seriously their obligations. And they went out and they had, at these kinds of meetings, they would have consumer forums and ask people with disabilities, what do you want us to be doing in Washington? And they came back and reported after doing a whole bunch of those, and Justin Dart, who was a member of the council at that time, went around the country formally holding meetings in every state and some of the territories and the districts.
If you can remember a time before the internet and email and video conferencing, the old way to do that was to go and meet people, actually talk to people face to face where they live. Imagine that. So critically important.
So they came back and they said, we heard over and over again that the number one thing that people with disabilities are saying to us is our biggest problem is not lack of services or lack of money, it's discrimination.
We weren't considered in the Civil Rights Act in '64 or in '68, right?
Right, absolutely not. And that was part of my legal career. I had represented clients whom I couldn't win cases for because there was no such law. And one of my personal stories was working my way through college as an assistant electrician, and I was thrown off the job site by a contractor who said, we don't want any cripples on this job. And I was really, I was being a cool electrician, and I had my tool belt on like a gunslinger's pistol, and wearing my hard hat. Anyway, I was completely, my macho bubble was burst, and I was really sad. And I wanted to say to that guy, you can't do that, that's against the law. But it wasn't against the law. And I found that out in even more detail when I was representing clients, and I'd have to say to them, that what happened to you was terrible. It's horrible, it's wrong, but it's not against the law. So I came into this with a feeling of there ought to be a law, and that guided a lot of my efforts.
So you went on the Civil Rights Commission thinking that may be where to deliver the law, or the launching pad. So you are a man on a mission just looking for the right launching pad to go off. And you found the National Council on Disability.
The local, I grew up in southern Indiana, the local newspaper talked about my tireless zeal. I don't know. I didn't know whether I was going to accomplish anything or not, but this was an opportunity. And Toward Independence, it not only suggests there be a comprehensive law prohibiting discrimination based on disability, it gave the name. One of the council members had said, if we're going to do this recommendation, we ought to call it something catchy, like Americans with Disabilities Act. And yeah, I really liked it, so that became the title.
2 years later, there was a second volume, right? And that is?
This one is a bigger thing I'm holding up. It's called On the Threshold of Independence. And Congress had once again said, 2 more years, give us another report. So we set about producing this report, in which Congress said, tell us about how we did in the last 2 years on the recommendations that you made. So we followed some of the same outline. This gets interesting on a personal level because Lex had hired a couple of other staff people, one of whom was a Dr. Andrea Farbman, known to most people as Andy. And she joined the council, and he put her in charge of this On the Threshold report. Well, in the meantime, in the background, I'm thinking, at some point, they're going to ask me to draft something because I'm their only lawyer. So I started on my own, without telling even Lex I was doing it. I started trying. I wanted to first of all see whether I thought it was doable, or if it was doable, could I do it? And I started writing a draft of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The upshot of that was, at a certain point, I had a draft. I had a full draft. I did a partial draft and then a second draft, and then I showed some things to some of the members of the council, but I didn't ever formally say that. They never said to me, draft an ADA.
You were ready to go.
I was ready to go.
Yeah.
When they finally did say draft an ADA, I had it.
There it is.
I had to still explain it to them and work with them and change some things and whatever.
And Bob, was it always the plan to have it included in on the threshold of independence?
You know that's not true.
I know. There's a what could have been moment which you really need to hear.
I got the draft finished. We were trying to get on the threshold of independence to the printers, and it was a deadline. Unfortunately, Lex Frieden was in the hospital, and so I'm meeting with this Farbman woman and discussing what we're going to do. We got to make a decision, and Lex isn't going to be here. And she said, I think you need to put that draft in the report. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Members of Congress like to say that they draft things. I mean, they don't actually often draft whole bills. It's staff people, it's outside groups, it's government groups do a lot of the drafting. And here we are. If we say the council did this, then Congress won't own it. They won't. I was really nervous about that. Andy was not.
She was insisting.
She was insistent, and the more she talked about it and why we should do it, in terms of getting the ideas out there so people in the world would know about it, in terms of giving organizations a chance to say that whether they supported it or not, she was right, and I went along with her, and she was proven more than right. The publication in Toward Independence of a draft bill was really a turning point. And it was true that consumer organizations, other national organizations, they had to confront this. Are we going to be for it or not? And mostly they were for it. So that was the 88 report. That came out in 88. And the council members were sort of moving on their own. Once we had it, they embraced it. I mean, they had voted for it. They had participated in iterations of it. But they went to members of Congress, including Senator Lowell Weicker, including Representative Coelho, and said, will you support this? Will you introduce it? And there was some hemming and hawing, but they did. So that in 1988, by the end of 1988, there was a bill in Congress. It had a number of supporters. There were congressional hearings, and it was my bill. It was just what I wrote with the input of the council. And I should interrupt myself here to say that one of my fears about trying to do this today is that there's too much to talk about, and I feel like it's if I invited you all into a restaurant and they had some nice dishes, but they didn't have enough food. And I feel like in this case, I'm not going to have enough time. I could not possibly. But in the meantime, another thing that Andy did was I'd been working. This is after the ADA was passed. I'm dropping out of order here, sorry. But Andy convinced me that who had been writing a book about this process and the council's role and the council's origin. I was writing lots of material, but I hadn't finished a book. And she said, well, maybe we should move to a different way. Maybe you should publish what you got and we'll create a website. So there is a website. It is called ADA Chronicles, all one word. It also has a secondary name, which is Burgdorf on Disability Rights. And I have been putting things on there. And on that website, there is a long section about this whole process from the beginning of the National Council through the introduction, and I'm still working on getting the details of the actual final enactment of it on the website. But I think it's, I speak unabashedly proud of it. It has lots of good information. It has a really good search function, and it's very accessible. It doesn't cost anything. We're not getting any money out of this. But if you want to know more about the details, I've put on there the very first half iteration of an ADA, mine, the second, the third, the partial finish, the finished one, the one that was approved by the council and put in thresholds.
One of the documents that you'll find on the website is the letter from Senator Weicker. It's actually the transcript of his comments when he was introducing Bob's bill in the Senate. And he described what it was like to live as a person with disability at that time, and that individuals weren't allowed to marry. Individuals with disabilities weren't allowed to vote. That if children were born with complications and they were deemed disabled, that medical providers could on their own determine not to provide any medication or any procedure intervene that would save their life. It was a life that was discarded. We were segregated. We were living less than second-class citizens. And that's what really motivated you to go to law school. And in law school, you started championing for people with disabilities, and you continued on to pursue that as a passion in your profession. And I know how challenging that was at that time, because there was no one else for you to look at. There wasn't a case board for you to refer to. There wasn't anybody else to say, hey, how do I write this other bill? The only thing that was out there, remotely close, was the Rehabilitation Act and Section 504. And there was some consideration I saw in the draft bills that the ADA would have contemplated replacing Section 504, correct? So there wasn't much to go on, but your dreams and your passion. And because you did what you did, it's a big friggin' deal. We are so better off. We are so better off. We are so better off. My third grandson was born 2.5 months ago. There were complications at birth. And he has loss of hearing. But because of what you have done, you have made the world better for him. And I am so grateful for what you've done. This is truly a man that deserves all the accolades that we could bestow upon him. Bob, I thank you for everything. This, unfortunately, has to be come to an end. But we truly, truly are grateful for everything you've done. Another round of applause for you. Bob, if you'll stand and join me.
I'm sorry?
If you'll stand and join me. Now, I noticed in your bio there's no military service.
I actually, another story, but this will be a short one. I got my 1A at one point, and I had to get on the bus with all the other guys and go to the, they call it recruiting center. Anyway, they looked at me and said, "You're not fit to serve." So, I mean, I was an athlete. I was a marathon runner. I was all kinds of things, but I wasn't good enough to serve my country. So there's no military service there, and
You served your country, and you served it very well. In honor of your service to the country, for your immense dedication, your passion, your drive to make the world a better place for people with disabilities, for the work that you did for the National Council on Disability, laying down the foundation for everything that we could benefit from today, we want to honor you with the Chairman's Award Please, Amanda. Please accept that as a small token of our sincere appreciation for all that you've done, sir. Thank you, Bob. This concludes the Zoom portion of the event. So everyone who's joined us via Zoom, thank you so very much.